This is Jameson, and I would like to talk about three short stories of Little Nemo as presented by Winsor McCay. Um, the first two appeared in 1911, and the last one appeared in 1912. I also posted the dates up above. So this first one of the ways that it's invented is look, the visual technique of every panel is the same, with subtle differences to carry the story along with dialogue. So it's just a little short story about how the monkey is standing up for himself after receiving encouragement from Little Nemo. But it's on this page, the panels are laid out 5 by 2, 5 across and 2 down, and it's very symmetrical, and the panels all line up pretty well. This is not always so symmetrical in other Little Nemo stories, which we'll see later. So another thing that makes this particular story unique stylistically is if you look at panel 9 and panel 10, there's bleed over with his leg, with the man's leg. And it's interesting because it almost looks like 9 and 10 are combined into one panel, but then you see the gutter separating 9 and 10. So then that almost makes it look like the man was almost into the room, and then by the time you get to the 10th panel, he's falling away, and all you see is his leg. But it's kind of interesting the way he's drawn it, because the bleed over makes it look like they're two combined panels when maybe they're not because of the gutter. So that I thought was very inventive and unique. As far as the animation is concerned, as I talked about, how every panel is virtually the same with the exception of subtle differences, that gives it the presentation of animation. So especially if you look at 5, 6, and 7, with the monkey in the process of falling in 5, landing on his owner at 6, and then almost kind of how shall we say, kind of rubbing it in his face, or kind of really giving it to his owner at 7. So there's a sequential order there. And we learn by the dialogue that the monkey is the one who needs to do the grinding on the organ, which brings me to the last point, which is older language that you don't really hear anymore. Organ grinding, that's just a slang way of saying you be the boss. I want to talk to the organ grinder, not the monkey. I want to talk to the boss, not the monkey. So when this is kind of taking place and the monkey is realizing he gets to be the organ grinder, he gets to be the boss, then that's when you see 5, 6, and 7, the monkey landing on his owner and kind of taking charge of the whole situation. So I thought that was pretty. I had to actually look that up because I didn't know what grinding on the organ meant. So that was a learning experience for me. Let's take a look at this next story. What I think is particularly unique is the story itself. An eagle being released from its cage demonstrates freedom. So it's kind of symbolic in a way, that because the eagle represents the United States and the cage represents not having freedom, and then in the end of the story, the eagle is as free as you could be, with playing with the children and holding a couple of flags and not being affected by all the noise and the toy cannons going off and the toy firecrackers going off. And you'd think that animals would be scared of something like that, but it doesn't affect the eagle at all because of his freedom and because of how happy he is to be he or she is to be free, excuse me. So I thought that was pretty unique, symbolically. Also, as far as animation is concerned, if you look at scene 7, scene 8, and especially scene 9, there's so much going, or excuse me, I meant to say panel 7, panel 8, and panel 9. There's so much going on in all three of those panels that it gives you a sense of animation with the explosions of the firecrackers and the toy cannons and smoke and everything else. Everyone, all the kid jumping and the little boys and girls having fun. There's just so much going on in all three of those panels that it gives a real sense of animation. I would say that there is a sense of animation in the earlier panels, but and it is very possible, and he does present animation techniques in the earlier panels, but it's more difficult to see when there's less going on in the scene visually. So if you take a look at panel 4, 5, and 6, the zookeeper is in different positions in every scene, as well as the boy, and so that kind of shows some animation there. But as far as older language that is used, in the first panel, the boy talks about aid of this flower, and when he's saying that, he's just talking about the help of this flower. And he actually used the flower in the previous story that I talked about with the monkey and the organ grinder. So he's using the flower once again in this story, and the aid just means help. Maybe even more difficult to kind of read between the lines is the word Zoe in panel 9. And Zoe is just a word for yay or admiration. It's pretty clear that that's what they're talking about here, because there's other words like yippee and hooray and hurrah and stuff like that. So it's kind of easy to understand what Zoe's means in that context, because you have other words meaning very similar to that: admiration, yay, hurrah, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at our final story. Right off the bat, one can see that this is inventive because of how it's flipped on its side. If one goes back and looks at all of McCay's stories, all of his works across all of the mostly Sundays that his stories appeared in, they're almost all up and down, like the previous two that we saw. Well, this one is a lot more rare because you just don't see stories of McCay's on their side like this. And the reader would have to tip their newspaper on the side to read it. So I could only imagine someone reading this particular section in the newspaper, and they're having their newspaper on its side. And could you see like somebody like looking at someone reading the newspaper on their side and then like wondering like, hey, why are you reading the newspaper on its side? And then they're like, oh, well, that's just the way it's presented. And then maybe there would be some laughs there. But anyway, so that's pretty inventive and pretty interesting. And as far as the animation is concerned, let's take a look at the upper part. So right here on 1, there's not much going on, but if you take a look at 2, you've got a little bit of a curtain, it looks like, almost coming down from the ceiling. And then on 3, it's even more pronounced. And by the time you get to 4 and 5, look at that top part of the ceiling. It's just like, it's all coming down. And by the time you get to 5, there's like, it's like the whole ceiling is imploding. So that's kind of interesting. that shows animation right there. And it's subtle enough, and there's enough going on in each panel that it makes the whole story kind of interesting enough to the point to where you don't always notice the ceiling coming down until you get to the fifth panel, and then you're like, oh my gosh, like how this ceiling get all the way down, and then you look back at the earlier panels, and they're like, oh, I guess it was gradually coming down all along. So I think the ceiling coming down shows animation. As far as interesting words that are used that we don't really use anymore, walloping means beating, which is seen in the fifth panel, and also in the sixth and final panel, when Little Nemo's parent says, "And quit yelling so!" exclamation point. Like, we might read that and quit yelling so and think it's a fragment. Like, and quit yelling so what? Like, quit yelling so loudly? Quit yelling so annoyingly? Like, but that's just the way that they spoke, probably in the early 1900s, I'm guessing. So I kind of imagine it as being how, like, you might read, like, poetry or something that says, oh, how I love you so, and just, like, ended at that. And that almost sounds like a frag. Like, I love you so much, I love you so, like, what? So that's kind of what I'm getting at here is, and quit yelling so, exclamation point, like, that's it. That's just kind of the way they talked back then. So anyway, those are my stories that I'm sharing, and hopefully there was some insight that you were able to learn, and I definitely learned a lot. So